I paid 50,000 euros for a luxurious family vacation. During dinner, my uncle raised his glass and said, "You've always been a failure until we raised you." My father smiled smugly. My mother continued cutting her steak. They laughed until I made my toast. At the end of the night, dinner no longer tasted so good. "You've always been a failure until we raised you." Uncle Javier's voice resonated above the clinking of glasses, loud and confident, as if he had just said something very clever. Some people laughed not because it was funny but because it was what they always did. My father smirked as he swirled his wine glass. My mother continued cutting her meat as if she hadn't heard anything. I sat there stirring my drink, observing the people seated around this long, expensive dining table, each of them enjoying the vacation I had paid for. 50,000 euros, flights, private chef, beachfront villa, everything. And yet somehow I was still the loser, because I didn't follow their plan. I wasn't the golden son like my brother Hugo, who took over the family business. I wasn't the perfect daughter like Clara, who married a rich lawyer and organized charity galas purely for appearances. I was the black sheep, the one who left law school, the one who chose to work with septic tanks instead of sitting in an office, the one who started a dirty business instead of a respectable one. Duke of Drains. Hugo once called me at a Christmas dinner, thinking he was the funniest man alive. Captain of the sewers, added Uncle Javier. At least someone in this family knows how to clean up the mess, I replied at the time, prompting some gasps. But that was the point. They laughed, they mocked, they joked about how shameful it must be that I made a living pumping septic tanks and transporting waste. And yet they never asked how much I actually earned. They never bothered to check the numbers when I started signing municipal contracts. They never noticed when I expanded to industrial clients. They never realized that my dirty money had paid for all of this. I exhaled, feeling the usual anger begin to grow inside me. The same one I always swallowed. The same one I let go because family is family, right? Not this time. I stood up and raised my glass. A toast. Everyone turned. Some eyebrows rose. I never made toasts. To family, I began, my voice light. To the people who always remind me where I come from. Some laughter. Hugo leaned back in his chair with a smug smile. He thought I was playing along. I smiled. And to me, I added, for paying for this entire trip. Silence. Uncle Javier's smile disappeared. My mother finally looked up. My father's fingers tightened around his glass. 50,000 euros, I continued, swirling my glass slowly. For the villa, the food, the endless bottles of wine you've all been enjoying. I took a sip, letting my words sink in. So cheers, I said, raising my glass a little higher. To the failure who somehow managed to pay for it all with the proceeds of a dirty job. Absolute silence. Hugo looked like he'd bitten into a lemon. Clara let out a nervous giggle. "Oh, come on," Clara said. "Javier was just joking." "Yeah," Uncle Javier muttered. "Just a joke." I looked at him and smiled. How curious. I don't hear anyone laughing. I drank the rest of my wine and sat back down. Suddenly, dinner no longer tasted so good to them. I leaned back in my chair, waiting for someone to speak. But they didn't. My father cleared his throat, as if he was about to say something clever, but instead he just swirled his wine glass. Uncle Javier stared at the table, as if he had just noticed the pattern of the tablecloth. My mother acted as if none of this involved her, but I saw it. I saw how the truth was eating away at them. What's wrong? I raised an eyebrow. Is the truth hard to swallow? Or is it just difficult to admit that this failure paid for all of this? It's not about the money, my brother Hugo finally spoke, placing his fork on his plate. It's about status. I laughed. Really? Tell me, does status pay the bills now, Hugo? Hugo frowned, but quickly regained his typical confidence. Don't be so simplistic, brother, he said, straightening his posture. We're building something bigger than just making money. The family business is about prestige, tradition, influence. You wouldn't understand. Why did you choose? Well, you know. I tapped the table softly with my fingers. Yes, let's talk about that. About your prestigious business, the one that, if I'm not mistaken, is barely staying afloat. The slight flicker of tension on Hugo's face was very satisfying. Tell me, who covered the losses last year? I tilted my head. Oh right, Dad had to take out another loan. And what about Clara's little boutique? Still in the red. No, but somehow I'm the one who gets mocked, even though I'm the only one at this table who can afford to pay for a family vacation without begging for an extension from the bank. Hugo's jaw tightened. That's not the point, he blurted out. There's more to life than just making money. It's about respect, influence, being part of something bigger. I smiled smugly. Right, so let me see if I understand. If you have trouble making ends meet, it's building a legacy. But if I'm successful in my field, I'm still a joke because my work isn't glamorous enough for you. Hugo gritted his teeth. Money isn't everything. I raised my glass and took a slow sip. Tell that to the waiter when he brings the bill. Silence. Because no matter how much they talked about status, in the end, I was the one maintaining this family's luxurious lifestyle, and they knew it. The silence hung over the table like a dense fog, laden with everything they wanted to say but couldn't or wouldn't. Hugo's jaw was tense. Clara avoided eye contact, suddenly fascinated by her wine glass. My father, Fernando, exhaled slowly through his nose, as he always did when trying not to lose his patience. And Uncle Javier just drummed his fingers against the table, still processing the fact that I had just shattered his concept of success in his face. Money isn't everything, Hugo repeated, his voice tighter this time. I chuckled and shook my head. Right, and yet for some reason none of you could afford this trip. Curious, isn't it? Clara finally spoke, in that exaggeratedly sweet tone she always used when trying to smooth things over. Look, no one is saying your work isn't important or… Really? I raised an eyebrow. Because the last time I mentioned it in a conversation, everyone acted like I should be ashamed. As if I should feel humiliated for having built something from scratch, just because it doesn't come with a fancy title or a corner office. Hugo scoffed. Come on, it's not the same. What you do is bleed Dad dry while pretending to be entrepreneurs. That shut him up for a moment. No one spoke. The only sound was the distant crash of waves against the shore outside the villa. The private chef, the endless bottles of imported wine. Suddenly it all seemed absurd. This whole trip, this whole facade of a family vacation, was based on the illusion that we were still the same family as years ago. But we weren't. I wasn't. And they hated that. I exhaled through my nose and leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. You know what really bothers me? The hypocrisy. Hugo rolled his eyes. Oh, here we go. I ignored him. You all love to talk about status, legacy, and prestige, but when it comes down to it, none of you do anything. You sit here living off a last name that means less every year, waiting for Dad to fix your problems, while looking down on me simply because I actually work. My father, Fernando, finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. Enough. I looked at him, my expression unreadable. Really? Because I'm just getting started. My father, Fernando, exhaled and rubbed his temples. No one doubts that you work hard. But in this family there are certain expectations, certain responsibilities. I let out a bitter laugh. Responsibilities? Like what? Pretending everything is fine while Hugo's grand business plans sink faster than an anchor? Covering Clara's terrible investments? Smiling while everyone pretends that I never would have made it without their help? Clara flinched. My father clenched his jaw. It's not. I sighed and leaned back in my chair. You know what? Let's stop pretending. Let's say it out loud. I opened my hands in a carefree gesture. To you, it doesn't matter how much money I make or how successful I am, you'll always think I don't belong at this table because of what I do. Because it's not respectable enough for you. No one contradicted me. That was all the confirmation I needed. I took my time letting the truth sink in. Then I picked up my glass, swirled the liquid inside, and took another sip. Well, here's a reality check. Prestige doesn't pay the bills. Status doesn't put food on the table. And respect. I let out a slight laugh. Respect means nothing, and those who demand it haven't earned it. Hugo abruptly pushed his chair back and stood up. You think you're better than us, don't you? I held his gaze. I don't. I placed my glass on the table. I just know my worth. And it turns out, my worth is far greater than that ridiculous title you keep chasing. Hugo opened his mouth as if to say something more, perhaps another insult, Perhaps a weak attempt to regain control of the conversation, but nothing came out. Instead, he shook his head and stormed out onto the balcony, slamming the door behind him. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. See? That's the difference between us. When things get uncomfortable, I stay. I face it. But you. I gestured towards the door. You run. My father looked tired, older somehow. You don't have to do this. Do what? I smiled humorlessly. Tell the truth. His lips pressed into a thin line. You're still part of this family. I stared at him for a long moment, then shook my head. No. My voice was firm, serene. I'm your son, yes. But family. Family doesn't treat you like this. I pushed my chair back and stood up. Where are you going? Clara asked cautiously. To enjoy the rest of my vacation. I turned to look at them one last time, my expression unreadable. You're welcome, by the way. And with that, I walked out of the room, leaving them sitting in the mess they had created. This time, I wasn't the one who was going to clean it up. I spent the next 2 days actually enjoying my vacation, without the constant sarcastic comments or judgmental stares. The villa finally felt like a paradise. I swam in the infinity pool overlooking the Mediterranean, drank my morning coffee on the balcony in complete tranquility, and even indulged in a private fishing excursion. For once, I wasn't just financing the luxury, I was living it. But of course, my family's silence didn't last long. On the third night, just as I was returning from a seaside dinner, I found my father waiting for me in the villa's living room, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. We need to talk. I sighed, tossing my sunglasses onto the table. Really? Sit down. I didn't. Fine. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. I'll get straight to the point. The business is in trouble. I smiled ironically. Wow, what a surprise. This isn't a joke. My career wasn't either, but that never stopped you from laughing at it. His eyes hardened with irritation, but he forced himself to maintain his composure. Look, I know we've had our differences. I let out a dry laugh. Differences? You mean the part where you and the rest of the family treated me like a second-class citizen, just because I didn't sit in a fancy office pretending to be important? That's not fair, my father Fernando said, but there was no real conviction in his voice. I crossed my arms. Tell me the truth. What's really going on? Because if you're here alone without Hugo or Clara, it means you're desperate. And I'd love to know why. He sighed again, heavier this time, and set his glass down on the table. We're losing money and fast. The last few years have been difficult, but now it's serious. We lost several key investors, and Hugo's latest expansion attempt was a disaster. The bank won't give us another loan. If we don't do something soon, the company could collapse. I let his words sink in, the silence stretching between us. So that was it. That was why they needed me now. Not because they suddenly saw my true worth. Not because they regretted treating me like an outsider. But because their golden boy, their precious legacy, had driven the business straight into the ground. I leaned against the counter and looked at him ironically. Let me guess. You want me to bail you out? He didn't say anything, but his silence was answer enough. I let out a short laugh and shook my head. You know, Dad, it's funny. A couple of nights ago, everyone was sitting around that table making sure I knew that no matter how much money I made, I would never be their equal. And now here you are asking me for help. It's not just about us, he said, a hint of frustration in his voice. There are employees who depend on us. Families who need their paychecks. This isn't just about pride. I tilted my head. Are you sure about that? Because if this was really just about protecting jobs, you would have swallowed your pride and asked me for help before everything went to hell. Instead, you waited until you had no other choice. Silence. I sighed and crossed my arms. Let me guess. You don't just need money, do you? You also need someone with an actual sense of business to fix Hugo's mess. My father didn't answer. He didn't need to. I let out a sarcastic snort. Wow. So let me recap. I was never good enough to sit at your table as an equal, but now suddenly I'm good enough to fix all your problems. Is that it? You're still part of this family, he tried to reason. I laughed. How convenient. At what point did I become family again? The instant you needed my bank account. My father's patience finally snapped. For God's sake, son, stop being so petty. This is bigger than you. I took a step forward, lowering my voice. No, Dad. This is the first time this is actually about me. I grabbed my sunglasses from the table and turned towards the stairs. Where are you going? To get some sleep. I shot him one last look over my shoulder. And just so we're clear, I'm not giving you a single cent. His expression hardened. Are you really willing to let your own family fail? I smiled. Not only am I willing for the first time, I'm willing to let you face your own consequences. And with that, I left him there, alone with his whiskey and his regrets. I knew my father wouldn't let it go. Rich and powerful people never do. They don't hear the word no. They don't believe in consequences, at least not for themselves. So when I woke up the next morning and found my mother, Isabel, sitting on the villa's terrace, sipping tea as if she'd been waiting for me, I wasn't surprised. Good morning, dear, she said softly, as if last night's conversation had never happened. I grabbed a cup of coffee from the kitchen and sat across from her, not bothering to feign politeness. Dad sent you. She smiled, but her eyes didn't reflect any warmth. Your father is upset. He doesn't understand why you're being so stubborn. I scoffed. You spent years making sure I knew I wasn't good enough for this family. Except now that you need my money, I'm suddenly valuable. Don't be dramatic, she said, setting her cup down on the table delicately. This is about family, about responsibility. I leaned back in my chair and crossed my arms. No, this is about control. Her expression didn't change, but I saw the slight tightening of her features. You don't care about my success, Mom. What bothers you is that I built something without you. For a second, her face hardened. Just a second. Then she recomposed herself. That's not true. I sighed, rubbing my temples. Mom, tell me what you really want. We want you to be part of something bigger. She clasped her hands together on the table, her demeanor calculating. We want you back in the family business. I couldn't help but laugh. You mean the business that's going bankrupt? The one Hugo drove into the ground. It's not failing. The bank disagrees. I shook my head, still smiling. This is unbelievable. For years everyone mocked my work. And now that I'm successful, you suddenly want me to drop everything and come running back? Why? Why now am I useful? You've always been useful, dear, she said softly. Just not in the right way. That stung. She saw it in my face and pressed her advantage. You have potential, but you've wasted it on. She made a vague gesture with her hand. Sanitation. I clenched my jaw. You mean running a profitable business? One that, by the way, is more successful than yours. That's not the point. Then what is the point, Mom? I leaned forward. Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you and Dad don't care what I do. As long as it fits into your perfect idea of what success should be. Image matters, she snapped, losing her composure for the first time. This family has a legacy to protect. You don't understand how important that is. I stood up, shaking my head. No, you don't understand. I don't need your approval. I never have. And I'm done playing by your rules. I turned to leave, but her next words stopped me in my tracks. What about Hugo? I paused. She seized the opportunity. He's your brother. If the business fails, what will happen to him? To his children? To Clara? To all of us? Ah, there it was. The emotional blackmail. I turned slowly. So that's it. Since you can't convince me with insults, now you're trying to guilt me into saving Hugo. I'm asking you to do the right thing. I laughed bitterly. You're not asking me to do the right thing. You're asking me to sacrifice myself so you don't have to face the consequences of your mistakes. You're asking me to clean up Hugo's mess, like I've always had to clean up this family's messes. Silence. My mother looked at me with something that almost resembled pity. You don't understand, do you? No matter how much money you make, no matter how successful you are, you'll never have what we have. Respect, status. I smiled. Respect, I said slowly. You mean that respect that disappears as soon as the money runs out? She didn't answer. I nodded as if I'd finally figured something out. See, that's the difference between us, Mom. I built something real. Something that doesn't crumble as soon as you take away the fancy last name. I don't need your respect. And I certainly don't need your approval. I took the last sip of my coffee. So no, Mom. I'm not going to save Hugo. I'm not going to save his business. I'm not going to save any of you. I set the cup down on the table and headed for the door. You want someone to clean up your mess? I turned one last time and looked at her over my shoulder. Hire a professional. I hear sanitation pays well. And with that, I walked away, leaving my mother in stunned silence. For the first time in her life, I should have known they wouldn't take no for an answer. The first sign came a few days later when I received a call from an old business associate, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Hey, just wanted to give you a heads up, he said cautiously. Your name's been coming up in some weird conversations. Some people are saying your business isn't as legitimate as it seems. I exhaled. Let me guess. My family. I didn't need to say it. It was classic damage control. If they couldn't get me to help them willingly, they'd try to pressure me. They'd start discrediting my work, spreading rumors that I was nothing more than a guy with a truck and a pump, not a real businessman. They'd use their social connections to turn people against me to make sure I needed them. But they underestimated something. I'd spent my entire career dealing with garbage, and I was very good at cleaning it up. So when I found out they were organizing a charity gala that weekend, one full of influential businessmen, socialites, and all those people my family desperately needed to impress, I decided it was time to return the favor. I walked into that event in a perfectly tailored suit, looking as successful as the people they wanted to impress. Heads turned as I entered the ballroom, and my mere presence was enough to drain the color from my mother, Isabel's face. What are you doing here? Hugo hissed, appearing at my side. I smiled. Oh, haven't you heard? I'm networking. Before he could respond, I moved into the crowd, shaking hands, starting conversations. And within minutes it was clear. They hadn't expected this. They expected me to stay in my place, to remain the lower-class worker they could look down on. They didn't expect me to show up. They didn't expect me to command attention. They didn't expect me to be able to talk business on their level. And then I made my final move. I waited until my father, Fernando, was in the middle of his speech, thanking donors and talking about legacy, before speaking up, my voice carrying across the ballroom. Speaking of legacy, I said, I just signed a new contract, one that's going to change the waste management industry in this city. People turned. Some looked intrigued. Others, my family, looked horrified. I smiled. In fact, my company just closed a deal with the city government. We'll be handling the sanitation of several major districts, including industrial zones. It's one of the biggest contracts in the sector this year. There was a beat of silence and then applause. People were impressed. Genuinely impressed. I saw investors whispering amongst themselves, nodding. Some even approached me immediately, congratulating me, asking for more details. And that's when I saw it, the realization in my father's eyes. He'd spent years telling himself that my business didn't matter, that I wasn't on his level, that I'd always be in his shadow. But now I just eclipsed him in front of his entire world. My mother tried to salvage the moment with a light laugh. Oh well, dear, he's always been so practical. I turned to her, still smiling. Yes, Mom. That's why I build things while your business crumbles. Hugo gritted his teeth. You think one contract changes anything? No, I said calmly. But the fact that I don't need you does. And with that, I took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter's tray, raised it in a mocking toast, and walked away. Because for the first time in my life I had nothing left to prove. A year later I was sitting in my office reviewing contracts, when my assistant knocked on the door. Sir, your father is here to see you. I didn't react immediately. I just let the words sink in. Tell him I'm not available. I looked out the window of my office, high up in a skyscraper. The city stretched before me, a view that once would have seemed impossible. But now it was mine. I inhaled slowly. No. Send him in. A minute later my father, Fernando, entered. He looked smaller, thinner. The weight of a failing business and a crumbling legacy had finally caught up with him. You're doing well, he said, glancing around. I nodded. I am. He hesitated a moment before speaking. The business is failing. I didn't react. Hugo has tried everything. Clara too. But we can't keep it afloat. He waited. We need help. And there it was. The thing they swore would never happen. I let out a slow sigh. You spent years telling me I wasn't good enough. That I wasn't one of you. That my work wasn't respectable. I saw him flinch. And now you want me to save it. Isn't that right? No, he said quickly. We're family. I leaned forward.
No.
We're not. His words caught in his throat. I meant it. You don't mean that, he said quietly. I held his gaze. Yes, I do. And for the first time I saw something in his face, realization. He finally understood that he'd lost me, that he'd pushed me away for too long, that there was no going back. He looked down. I'm sorry. The words were barely a whisper. I watched him for a long moment, then stood up and adjusted my suit. I know. And I escorted him to the door. Because no matter how much they regretted it, no matter how much they wished they could undo the past, I was done cleaning up their messes. They had made their choice and I had made mine.